When the crowd fades and the final whistle dissolves into the night, what's left behind isn't glory, it's silence. The kind of silence that creeps into the tunnels beneath the stadium, where sweat still clings to the concrete and the smell of turf and adrenaline lingers in the air. It's there, in that quiet, that the truth of the game begins to whisper. Football is a sport of collisions, bone against bone, ego against ego, truth against illusion. The roar of victory covers the fractures for a moment, but only for a moment. Beneath every championship ring lies a story that doesn't fit neatly on a highlight reel. It's the story of what had to be hidden, buried, or endured for that glory to shine. The story of the men and organizations who triumphed through scandal, not in spite of it, but sometimes because of it. I've seen locker rooms where celebration and shame live side by side. Helmets piled like trophies of conquest, while outside the doors, investigations were already unfolding. I've seen coaches address their teams with trembling hands, knowing the headlines waiting for them tomorrow would turn their triumph into a trial. And I've seen fans, millions of them, choose faith over truth because the truth would hurt too much to believe. The NFL sells stories of perfection, dynasties, heroes, clean victories. But peel back the surface, and you'll find a different kind of mythology. One where redemption often begins in disgrace. One where teams accused, fined, and condemned rise higher than ever before. The Patriots after Spygate, the Saints after Bountygate, the Ravens after Ray Lewis's trial. Each time the league tried to clean its image, but the game itself seemed to feed on the chaos. Because in football, scandal doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it purifies. It's an old truth, one the league has never fully acknowledged. When a team's image burns, what survives is something element of the hunger to prove everyone wrong. The world forgets that shame and motivation share the same heartbeat. Every accusation is fuel. Every headline a reminder that victory, once tainted, can become legend if reclaimed. I think about the 2012 New Orleans Saints, a team accused of putting bounties on opposing players, of turning injury into strategy. They were dragged through hearings, suspensions, and public humiliation. Yet that same locker room, fractured, humiliated, found a strange kind of faith. In the wake of punishment, they built resilience. The same city that once drowned under a hurricane now found its team drowning under scandal. And both times, New Orleans rose. Or take the Patriots. In 2007, caught filming opponents' signals. Again in 2015, accused of tampering with footballs. The outrage was national. Commentators screamed for accountability. The commissioner declared war. But then came the response to fury of a team determined to make the accusations meaningless. They didn't fade. They evolved. In the years after Spygate and Deflategate, New England built one of the most dominant dynasties in professional sports. Scandal didn't end them. It clarified them. But what does that say about the game itself? What kind of sport thrives on redemption, born from disgrace? Every league faces scandal, but football's relationship with it is different. Baseball's betrayals are written in statistics asterisks next to home runs. Basketball's in personality's ego, money, loyalty. But football scenes are structural. They seep into the rules, the hits, the culture of do whatever it takes. Every team that rises through scandal tells us something dark about the machine. That, in the NFL, morality is negotiable, but winning is eternal. There's a reason the league calls itself a shield. Shields protect. They also hide. Behind that emblem, the NFL has survived gambling scandals, concussion cover-ups, bounty systems, and corruption reaching from ownership to officiating. Each time the shield holds. Each time the public outrage fades. And each time the sport returns stronger, richer, more mythic than before. That's what makes these stories so unsettling. We remember the glory of the rings, the confetti, the speeches, but we forget the courtroom lights, the the leaked recordings, the apologies written by PR teams instead of men. And yet, maybe that's why we can't look away. Because these teams, flawed as they are, mirror something deeply human. They fall, they suffer. They fight to rebuild what they destroyed. Maybe that's why scandal doesn't end them. It defines them. I remember sitting once in an empty stadium long after a championship game. The field was torn, the seats half-lit, the echoes of celebration still clinging to the air. And I realized that what stays with you after a season like that isn't the glory it is, the contradiction. The quiet truth that a team can be both guilty and great. That redemption doesn't erase sin, it lives alongside it. Think of the Ravens in 2000. Their defense was a machine of violence and control. But their leader, Ray Lewis, walked into that season under the shadow of a murder trial. The charges were reduced, the story never fully settled. Yet that year, the Ravens delivered one of the most dominant defensive performances in NFL history. A paradox. A man accused of darkness becoming the heartbeat of a champion. The media couldn't reconcile it, but the fans did. They forgave because he delivered. Forgiveness, that's the currency of this league. Not honesty, not purity. Forgiveness earned through winning. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth about us, too. We want heroes, but we accept sinners so long as they bring us victory. Every time a team rises from scandal, America's collective memory resets. We rewrite the past through the scoreboard. But what happens when the scoreboard becomes the only moral compass that matters? The league has always walked that razor's edge between spectacle and sanctity. Players become legends while carrying secrets. Coaches build dynasties under suspicion. Owners talk about integrity in press conferences while negotiating settlements behind closed doors. The NFL doesn't just survive, scandal it absorbs it, metabolizes it, turns it into storyline. Because in this sport, redemption sells better than perfection. Every scandal creates a villain. Every comeback creates a hero. Sometimes they're the same person. That's the mythology that keeps the machine alive. And maybe that's why the silence after the crowd fades feels so heavy. Because when the noise is gone, the players know what we often forget. The confetti always falls over someone else's pain. The truth is, football is built on contradiction. Discipline born of chaos. Brotherhood born of competition. Glory born of scandal. You can't separate one from the other without breaking the spell. So tonight, we're not celebrating victory. We're digging beneath it. Beneath the rings, the banners, the parades. We're looking at what it takes for a team to rebuild not just their image, but their soul. We'll revisit the locker rooms that turned shame into defiance, the headlines that became motivation, the seasons that began in disgrace and ended in immortality. This is the side of football the league would rather forget. The stories that stain the shield but also prove its power to endure. Because when you strip away the slogans, the sponsorships, the highlight reels, you're left with something raw and unsettling. The simple human truth that greatness and guilt often share the same jersey. In this documentary, we're going to walk through the fire with them. The teams who lost their way. The teams who were mocked, fined, exposed and yet somehow, in the end, lifted trophies higher than ever before. This isn't a story about perfection. It's a story about resilience forged in disgrace. About the players who fell from grace and still found a way to win. About the organizations that rebuilt themselves from public ruin into legends carved in silver and gold. Because in the NFL, scandal is never the end of the story. It's the beginning of the next chapter. And when the lights go out and the field falls silent, that's when you start to hear it, the quiet, steady heartbeat of redemption. They say football builds character. But if you've been close enough to the field, long enough to see how the game really operates, you learn something far less poetic. Football doesn't build character, it reveals it. And sometimes, what it reveals isn't heroism or virtue, but the lengths to which people will go to protect a dream. The National Football League was born not out of purity, but survival. In the early 1900s, when towns like Canton, Dayton, and Decatur gave rise to the first professional teams, the line between competition and corruption was thin. Players were paid under the table, referees were bribed, and owners looked the other way so long as the crowds kept coming. The sport that would one day claim to represent America's moral backbone began in the mud both literally and figuratively. Even in those early decades, scandal wasn't an interruption. It was a rhythm. In 1925, the league nearly collapsed after a team from Pottsville was stripped of its championship over a disputed exhibition game. Accusations of favoritism, political pressure, and manipulation tore through the headlines. The following year, gambling whispers started spreading around Chicago's pro teams. The league responded not by reforming, but by learning how to hide its dirt more carefully. By the 1950s, television had arrived. America was changing, and so was football. The NFL realized that scandal could destroy a reputation, but it could also feed the machine. Public outrage became part of the spectacle. A commissioner could suspend a player on Monday and see ratings rise by Sunday. The Shield logo wasn't just a brand, it was armor. And behind that armor, the league began to construct the mythology of moral clarity. Yet the cracks never disappeared. There was the betting scandal of 1963, when two Green Bay Packers, Paul Hornung and Alex Karras, were suspended for gambling. The league called it a betrayal of integrity. The fans called it human. When both men returned, they were welcomed with applause. The message was clear. Redemption was not only possible, it was profitable. The 1970s were supposed to be the golden era of toughness. Steel curtains, silver bullets, purple people eaters. But off the field, the sport was facing its own reckoning. Drug use was rampant, from amphetamines to painkillers that numbed more than just injuries. Coaches turned blind eyes. Team doctors kept silent, and owners signed checks to keep the cycle going. Yet the public image was sanitized, grit, and glory for the cameras, silence for everything else. In the 1980s, the game became a national religion, and its scandals grew more complex. The league entered an age of dynasties and dollars. The Washington Redskins rose under Joe Gibbs, the 49ers under Bill Walsh, the Raiders under Al Davis. But so did whispers of tampering, steroid abuse, and collusion between franchises and league offices. Every Sunday, fans tuned in for a morality play. But behind the scenes, the league had learned to choreograph both the victory and the controversy. It wasn't until the 1990s that the cracks began to widen into something undeniable. Domestic violence cases, drug suspensions, salary cap manipulations. One chipped away at the idea that the NFL represented American virtue. Yet paradoxically, every fall from grace was followed by a rise. The Cowboys, branded as America's team, became a symbol of both dominance and dysfunction. Scandal didn't destroy them, it defined them. The Raiders thrived on the outlaw image. The league marketed rebellion because rebellion sold jerseys. By the 2000s, football was no longer a game. It was a billion-dollar ecosystem, self-sustaining and self-forgiving. When Spygate broke in 2007, revealing that the New England Patriots had secretly filmed opponents, signals the moralists called for punishment. What they got was something else, a dynasty reborn. Under scrutiny, Tom Brady and Bill Belichick didn't fade. They became untouchable. The controversy became part of their legend. The Saints followed a similar path. When the Bountygate scandal surfaced in 2012, accusing defensive coaches of paying players to injure opponents, the outrage was visceral. Yet in the years that followed, New Orleans found rebirth through adversity. The team's identity as both sinner and survivor became a mirror for its city, a place that had endured disaster and still found hope. These stories reveal something profound about the American relationship with football. We demand accountability, but we reward redemption. We condemn scandal, but we never turn away from it. In truth, the league doesn't just endure controversies engineered too. The constant cycle of fall and forgiveness keeps the public hooked, the narrative alive, and the ratings higher than ever. But beneath the surface, something darker lingers. For every headline scandal that ends in a public apology, there are 100 smaller ones buried in silence. Hidden injuries, hush payments, unreported concussions, players discarded once their usefulness ends. The league's image is immaculate because it has to be, but the price of that perfection is denial. What fascinates me isn't just how these teams survive scandal, it's how they use it, how they turn disgrace into drive. It's a uniquely American alchemy: to fall publicly, to suffer publicly, and then to rebuild publicly until the very act of survival becomes virtue. Every time a team rises from ruin, it feeds our belief that anyone can be redeemed. And yet, redemption in the NFL is rarely about truth. It's about winning. The scoreboard is the confessional. Victory is the absolution. If you lift the Lombardi Trophy, the past becomes negotiable. The league knows it, the players know it, and deep down, so do we. Look at the patterns. The Patriots' post-scandal dominance, the Saints' emotional resurgence, the Ravens' defensive redemption. Each one follows the same arc: a crisis, an awakening, and then a coronation. But what we call resilience might also be something else: a refusal to acknowledge the cost. For every team that overcame disgrace, there were players whose bodies broke in silence, whose reputations never recovered, whose names were erased from the story. Football's appeal has always been its contradictions. It's a game that preaches teamwork while demanding sacrifice. It glorifies honor but rewards violence. It promises redemption but monetizes failure. The teams that endure scandal and rise again just reflect the sport's complexity; they embody it. And that's what this journey is about. Not the highlight reels or the post-game interviews, but the hidden truths that define the game's soul. We're not here to celebrate. We're here to understand. To look at how scandal doesn't just test teams, it transforms them. How every fall reveals something about who we are as fans, as a culture, as a nation addicted to both punishment and comeback stories. Because football isn't just America's game, it's America's mirror. Every time a team is caught cheating, or covering up, or crossing a moral line, we don't turn away. We lean closer. We want to see how they'll recover, how they'll spin it, how they'll rise again. In their scandal, we see our own contradictions, our hunger for victory, our need for redemption, and our willingness to forgive so long as the scoreboard tilts our way. The truth is, the NFL has always been a theater of controlled chaos. Scandal isn't an interruption of that theater, it's part of the act. It reminds us that perfection is an illusion, that greatness comes at a cost, that the game's beauty and brutality are inseparable. The teams who overcame disgrace didn't do it by denying their darkness; they embraced it, reshaped it, and turned it into momentum. So as we step deeper into this story, don't expect a list of controversies or a parade of shame. Expect something harder: an autopsy of greatness under fire. We'll trace the lineage of scandal from the league's dusty origins to the billion-dollar stadiums of today. We'll walk through the locker rooms where silence was law, the courtrooms where truth flickered, and the redemption arcs that rewrote history. These are not stories of perfect men or perfect organizations. They are stories of endurance, of ego, of the human capacity to adapt when reputation collapses. They are proof that in the NFL, as in life, the path to glory often winds through the wreckage of disgrace. And when we finish this journey, maybe we'll understand why. Why scandal never really ends a dynasty. Why redemption sells better than honesty. And why the shield, for all its cracks, still gleams under the lights. Because in the end, this isn't just about football. It's about what happens when the pursuit of victory collides with the cost of integrity, and why. No matter how dark it gets, we still can't look away. There's a peculiar kind of silence that follows a scandal. It isn't the silence of peace or finality, it's the heavy, loaded quiet of a sport holding its breath, unsure whether it will ever be trusted again. In the earliest days of professional football, that silence loomed large over muddy fields and half-built stadiums. Long before billion-dollar broadcasts and celebrity quarterbacks, the league was a fragile organism, raw, desperate, and dangerously close to tearing itself apart. And yet, in those fragile beginnings, the DNA of redemption began to form. The National Football League was not born as America's pristine pastime. It clawed its way up from chaos. The 1920s saw the league's first great identity crisis. Professional football, to the purists, was a lesser form of the game, sullied by paychecks and self-interest. College football was where honor lived. The pros were a ragtag collection of factory men, steelworkers, and ex-college players looking for a few dollars and one more shot at glory. But as the sport grew, so did the temptation to control its outcome. Rumors of game fixing circulated before the NFL even had proper standings. In 1925, the Pottsville Maroons scandal rocked the league to its foundation. The Maroons were a powerhouse team from Pennsylvania, tough, talented, and beloved by their local fans. That year, they beat the Chicago Cardinals and were considered by most to be the rightful champions. But then came the decision that would echo for decades. Pottsville scheduled an unauthorized exhibition game in Philadelphia, violating league territory rules. For that, the NFL stripped them of their title. The Cardinals were crowned instead. Was it punishment or politics? Even then, fans asked the same question we still ask today: was the league protecting its rules or its image? Pottsville cried foul, claiming they were scapegoated to protect bigger markets. The outcry was fierce, and the controversy never died. A championship had been decided not on the field, but in the boardroom. It was the first major wound to the league's credibility, and the first test of whether football could survive scandal. It did. Because football, even then, had a secret weapon: the public's hunger for redemption. Fans wanted to believe their sport could cleanse itself. They needed to believe that the next game would be pure, that tomorrow would be different. And that belief became the fuel for survival. In the 1930s, the NFL was still crawling out of obscurity. The Great Depression had gutted attendance. Teams folded overnight, and the sport's reputation remained fragile. But in the shadows, something remarkable was happening. The league was beginning to understand that the story of football wasn't just about dominance, it was about endurance. Every scandal, every misstep became part of a larger mythology: fall, fracture, rebuild. It was as if redemption was woven into the playbook. The Chicago Bears embodied that spirit. Under George Halas, they didn't just dominate, they professionalized the game. But even they weren't immune to controversy. The league's roughness, the backroom deals, the brutal labor practices, all were whispered about. The NFL was becoming a spectacle, but at a human cost. Players played hurt because they couldn't afford not to. Coaches hid injuries to keep ticket sales up. The league's public face was clean. But behind the curtain was a machine grinding its way toward legitimacy, one moral compromise at a time. And yet, out of that murky evolution came something beautiful: the idea that resilience itself could redeem. The NFL learned that the public would forgive almost anything, so long as the game remained sacred. When a team fell, what mattered wasn't the fall, it was how they stood again. That belief became the league's backbone, the unwritten code of its existence. The first generation of stars, Red Grange, Bronco Nagurski, Don Hudson, became the league's armor against its own flaws. They gave fans something to believe in, faces that transcended controversy. Red Grange's jump from college to the Chicago Bears in 1925 was seen by some as a betrayal of amateur purity. But to millions, it was liberation. It meant football could be professional, legitimate, proud. His barnstorming tour across America drew tens of thousands, proving that even amid scandal, the game could rise. But redemption isn't a one-time event, it's a cycle. The more football rose, the more it invited scrutiny. The 1940s brought whispers of game manipulation tied to gamblers. With low player salaries and little oversight, temptation was everywhere. There was talk of players taking it easy for side payments, though few were ever proven. The league walked a fine line between denial and quiet cleanup. Commissioner Bert Bell, who had seen his own team struggle to survive, recognized that football's future depended not on a racing scandal, but mastering it. His creation of the NFL draft in 1936 and the emphasis on parity were attempts to rebuild trust, to ensure fans believed competition was fair, even if the world around it wasn't. By the 1950s, football had become more than sport, it was becoming identity. Television was transforming everything. Games were now broadcast into living rooms. And the NFL began to realize it wasn't just selling competition, it was selling morality, aspiration, redemption. Every Sunday was a sermon in resilience, broadcast coast to coast. Scandal became both threat and fuel. The more the league grew, the more it needed to prove its integrity, and the more those moments of disgrace defined its rebirths. It's no coincidence that the NFL's most enduring storylines century comebacks. Underdog champions, players reclaiming their names, mirror the same arc that saved the league itself. From its earliest scandals, football learned to absorb shame and turn it into narrative power. The players might change. The controversies evolve from territorial violations to doping, from off-field crime to corporate deceit, but the heartbeat remains the same. Fall, rise, atone. When we talk about redemption in football, we're really talking about identity. The league was born from disgrace and desperation, not perfection. Its first champions were imperfect men in a broken system, doing their best to build something bigger than themselves. Every future scandal, every headline that screamed betrayal or corruption was simply a new verse in that same song. To understand how the NFL became the colossus it is today, we have to understand those origins. Because football didn't escape scandal, it was forged by it. The discipline, the loyalty, the obsession with second chances, these weren't virtues discovered later. They were survival instincts honed in the mud and politics of the 1920s and 30s. By the time the league merged into the television age, it had already built the myth that would carry it through every crisis to come, that no matter how deep the fall, the comeback is always greater. That myth would define generations. It would make legends out of men who stumbled. It would turn disgrace into drama, punishment into platform, and pain into poetry. Because football, like the nation it represents, has always loved its fallen heroes so long as they rise again. The NFL's first century is not a story of spotless glory. It's a story of redemption repeating itself in new forms, decade after decade. It began with Pottsville. It would continue with gamblers, cheaters, rule breakers, and liars. But it would always end the same way, with a team, a city, and a league standing tall again under the lights, daring us to believe once more. And that belief, that fragile, fervent faith in redemption, would become the most powerful weapon in the league's history. There was a time when the word Raiders didn't just mean a football team. It meant rebellion. It meant menace, swagger, defiance. The black and silver weren't just colors, they were a declaration. We are not like them. That was the silent message that Al Davis carved into the soul of his franchise, a message that would outlive him, and in some ways, outlast the game itself. But before the Raiders became a symbol, they were a problem for the league, for their opponents, and for themselves. In the 1960s, the NFL was an establishment sport, polished and respectable. The Raiders, born in the AFL in 1960, were the opposite. They didn't come from money or prestige. They came from the outer limits. Oakland, a city that mirrored their attitude, industrial, gritty, and ignored. When Al Davis took over in 1963, everything changed. He wasn't just a coach. He was a visionary who saw chaos not as a threat, but as opportunity. Davis built the Raiders' identity around the very thing other teams feared: their lack of respectability. He made scandal a weapon. "Just win, baby," became his gospel, a phrase that erased morality and replaced it with victory. The Raiders didn't play clean, they played mean. And that was the point. Their defensive schemes bordered on brutal. Their players, Jack Tatum, George Atkinson, Lyle Alzado, weren't just enforcers. They were avatars of controlled violence. They turned intimidation into art. Opponents accused them of late hits, cheap shots, and psychological warfare. But Al Davis didn't apologize. He doubled down. He once said, "The greatness of the Raiders is in their future." What he meant wasn't simply winning Super Bowls, it was rewriting the rules of how a team could survive scandal. Because while other franchises tried to distance themselves from controversy, Davis understood something deeper. Controversy sells. Scandal attracts attention, and attention fuels legacy. In the 1970s, while the Steelers and Cowboys built dynasties on discipline and image, the Raiders built one on infamy. They embraced their outlaw reputation so fully that it became their armor. When referees flagged them, fans cheered louder. When the league office fined them, it only added to the mythology. Oakland wasn't just winning games. They were building a brand of defiance that would redefine American sports culture. Every villain needs a story, and Davis gave them one. The Raiders were the misfits of the league, the castaways. They were the players no one else wanted. Men with reputations, tempers, or scars that made them unemployable elsewhere. Davis collected them like stray dogs and gave them purpose. He saw loyalty in rebellion. He saw unity in anger. And he turned that chemistry into dominance. By 1976, the Raiders had become America's anti-heroes. They won their first Super Bowl that year, crushing the Minnesota Vikings in Super Bowl XI. To their fans, it was vindication proof that outsiders could not only belong, but conquer. To their critics, it was validation of everything wrong with the game. Aggression without restraint, power without humility. But Al Davis didn't care about being liked. He cared about being remembered. "You don't adjust, you dominate," he said. It was that mentality that turned every scandal into a statement. When players brawled, when fines came, when commentators called them dirty, Davis smiled. Because he understood something that the rest of the league hadn't yet grasped. That in the modern era, morality wasn't marketable, but identity was. The Raiders became the first franchise to turn infamy into brand equity. Their pirate logo became a flag for those who felt excluded, rejected, or underestimated. It wasn't about football anymore. It was about belonging to something raw and real. Their reputation followed them wherever they went. In the 1980s, Davis waged war against the NFL itself. He sued the league for the right to move his team from Oakland to Los Angeles, arguing that the NFL's control was unconstitutional. It was one of the most contentious legal battles in sports history. Davis stood alone against the machine, his team becoming a symbol of defiance, not just on the field, but in the courts. And when he won, it wasn't just a victory for his franchise. It was a statement that the establishment could be challenged and beaten. In a sense, Al Davis became the embodiment of the American contradiction. A man who believed in rules only so he could learn how to break them better. But the price of rebellion is isolation. By the late 1980s, Davis's relationship with the league was irreparable. The Raiders' image, once electric, began to curdle. The violent play that had once thrilled audiences was now condemned in an era shifting toward safety and image control. Players like Lyle Alzado became cautionary tales. His steroid admission and early death painted a darker side of the team's obsession with dominance. The Raiders' swagger had always danced with danger. Now, danger was catching up. Still, through scandal, lawsuits, and cultural backlash, the Raiders' legend only deepened. They represented something pure in its defiance, a refusal to conform. Even when their losses piled up, even when their stadiums emptied, the image endured. Fans in black and silver face paint didn't come for victories. They came for identity. To be a Raider wasn't about success, it was about survival, and that's what made them timeless. Because the Raiders didn't escape scandal, they metabolized it. Every headline about violence, every accusation of cheating or thuggery became part of their DNA. In a way, Al Davis built the first truly postmodern football empire, one that understood perception mattered as much as performance. They were the league's shadow conscience. When the NFL sold integrity, the Raiders sold authenticity. When the league cleaned up its image, the Raiders reminded everyone what the game used to be: raw, violent, imperfect, human. Even in their decline, the mythology persisted. When the team moved back to Oakland, then later to Las Vegas, the outlaw ethos came with them like a ghost. Generations of fans who had never seen the 1970s Raiders still carried that spirit. The black hole in the stands, the chants of "just win, baby," the swagger of silver helmets under harsh lights, all of it born from that original rebellion. In a sport obsessed with control, the Raiders stood for chaos. And chaos, paradoxically, gave football meaning. Because what Al Davis understood, and what the NFL would spend decades trying to suppress and then later imitate, was that people didn't remember perfection. They remember conflict. They remember the fight. The Raiders' story isn't one of redemption through repentance. It's redemption through defiance. They didn't change who they were to be accepted. They forced the world to accept them as they were. And in doing so, they changed the very concept of scandal in sports. Before Al Davis, scandal was something to survive. After Al Davis, it was something to use. The Raiders proved that shame could be repurposed into identity, and that the same fire that burns reputations can also forge legends. Today, when teams are caught cheating, when players are suspended, when owners are exposed, the league responds with statements, apologies, and damage control. But deep down, every fan still feels a spark of that old Raider energy, that thrill of rebellion, that attraction to the outlaw spirit. Because somewhere in football's DNA, Al Davis's code still lingers. It whispers through every touchdown dance, every sideline argument, every underdog defiance. You can't control chaos. You can only play through it. The Raiders never needed forgiveness. They needed only belief. And that, perhaps, is the truest form of redemption. Not to be cleansed, but to endure. Every era of football carries its own illusion. A story the league tells itself to justify the violence beneath the pageantry. In the 1980s, that illusion was power. Bigger, faster, stronger. That was the mantra. Weight rooms replaced locker rooms as the sacred spaces of football. And in those dimly lit temples of iron, a new gospel was written. Not in playbooks, but in vials and syringes. This was the decade when muscle became myth. When strength itself became the currency of greatness. It was the age of linebackers who looked carved from stone, of defensive lines that moved like armies. Stadiums roared for collisions so loud they drowned out everything else. The 1980s didn't just celebrate dominance, it demanded it. And as the stakes rose, so did the pressure to meet impossible expectations. Somewhere between ambition and survival, ethics began to blur. The first whispers came quietly from training rooms, from rival coaches, from journalists who noticed how bodies seemed to change faster than biology allowed. It wasn't just one team or one player. It was everywhere. The unspoken arms race of size and speed had begun, and no one wanted to be left behind. The Pittsburgh Steelers of the 1970s had already built their legend on ferocity. The steel curtain, the embodiment of toughness. Even as the dynasty faded, new questions emerged. Years later, players would speak of supplements, vitamin shots, and team doctors who blurred the line between medicine and enhancement. Nothing was proven in court, but the rumors clung to the legacy like shadow. And that was the uncomfortable truth about the steroid era. You could never tell where the line truly was, only that it was always moving. By the early 1980s, the movement was no longer hidden. It was industrial. Lyle Alzado, one of the decade's most feared defensive ends, would later confess that steroids had been part of his life for over 2 decades. His transformation was visible. Once a powerful but mortal player, he became a monster in pads, faster, angrier, more explosive. Alzado's confession in 1991 wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation of what everyone already suspected. His death from brain cancer at 43 became a tragic symbol of the price paid for invincibility. But Alzado wasn't alone. He was the face of a culture that rewarded results and ignored the methods. Teams didn't ask questions because they didn't want answers. Coaches turned a blind eye because winning cured everything. The league, awash in television money and surging popularity, couldn't afford scandal. It needed heroes, not investigations. The NFL's silence wasn't ignorance, it was survival. Testing protocols were weak, enforcement was inconsistent, and public relations mattered more than accountability. Players joked that the league tested once a year if they remembered. The message was clear: don't get caught and don't talk. In the locker rooms of champions, steroids became a whispered form of insurance. Not every player used them, but every player knew someone who did. It was the cost of keeping up in a sport where your livelihood depended on your body's ability to do the impossible. The San Francisco 49ers of the 1980s embodied precision, intelligence, and finesse. Joe Montana's calm, Jerry Rice's perfection, Bill Walsh's West Coast genius. But even their dominance existed in the shadow of a league that was chemically shifting. The game around them was changing, morphing into something faster, harder, more brutal. To compete meant adapting, and adaptation had consequences. The Los Angeles Raiders, the Chicago Bears, the Washington Redskins, all symbols of 1980s power, built dynasties through size and strength that seemed beyond natural. The 1985 Chicago Bears remain perhaps the most iconic defensive unit ever assembled. Feral, violent, and unrelenting. Men like Mike Singletary, Richard Dent, and William Refrigerator Perry became cultural icons of brute force. The 46 defense crushed quarterbacks and erased offensive schemes. They didn't just beat teams, they humiliated them. But behind the domination was an unspoken reality, a generation of players training beyond human limits. Some were chemically enhanced. Others were simply casualties of a system that demanded superhuman endurance. Either way, the line between performance and self-destruction was fading fast. NFL films glorified the carnage in slow motion, turning pain into poetry. The sight of a lineman collapsing in exhaustion, the crunch of helmets colliding. It all became part of the aesthetic of greatness. And the league, eager to grow, allowed the mythology to flourish. Steroids weren't the problem. They were the invisible scaffolding that held the illusion of invincibility in place. When the federal government launched investigations into steroid trafficking in sports in the late 1980s, football was conspicuously quiet. Baseball took the brunt of the attention. Football stayed in the shadows. The NFL's first formal testing policy didn't arrive until 1989, and even then, it was riddled with loopholes. Players could be tested only once a year during training camp, hardly a deterrent. By then, the damage was already done. The steroid era had redefined the aesthetics of the sport. Fans no longer wanted to see men playing football. They wanted to see gladiators in helmets. The culture had changed so completely that the natural body was no longer enough. The myth of toughness had evolved into something darker, a celebration of self-destruction. And yet, as it always does, football found a way to reframe its sins as sacrifices. When players like Alzado spoke of their regrets, the league painted them as tragic heroes, not victims of neglect. The narrative shifted from accountability to redemption. The same machine that fueled the scandal found a way to sell its aftermath. That's the quiet genius and tragedy of the NFL. Every scandal becomes a story. Every disgrace becomes a lesson. Every fall becomes a rise. The steroid era wasn't erased. it was rewritten as a tale of courage and endurance. Players who broke themselves in pursuit of dominance became symbols of passion and commitment. The league, once again, turned scandal into mythology. But the cost never vanished. The toll showed up in bodies that failed too soon, knees that gave out, hearts that stopped, minds that unraveled. Behind the highlight reels of the 1980s were hundreds of forgotten players who lived and died in the shadows of that pursuit for size and speed. They weren't T-villains or cheaters. They were products of an unrelenting system that equated worth with pain tolerance. In the decades since, the league has tried to distance itself from that legacy. It has implemented stricter testing, embraced player wellness initiatives, and positioned itself as a guardian of integrity. But the truth remains buried beneath decades of silence. The modern game was built on the bodies of men who believed they had to be more than human just to survive. The steroid era left a paradox that still haunts football today. The players became stronger, but the soul of the game grew weaker. Strength had been the goal. But in chasing it, football lost something else: innocence, trust, perhaps even honesty. And yet, like every scandal before and after, the sport didn't crumble. It adapted. It learned how to hide better, how to manage the optics, how to shape new narratives of recovery and reform. The league's survival has always depended on its ability to turn damage into drama, sin into storyline. The 1980s gave us football at its most thrilling and most dangerous. It was a time when the game looked like war and felt like religion. A time when men turned themselves into machines, and machines eventually broke. It's easy to look back and condemn. But to understand the steroid era is to understand the impossible demands placed on those who played. They were indeed chasing glory. They were chasing survival in a world that punished weakness and rewarded pain. Every flexed muscle, every torn ligament, every scream under the barbell, it all pointed to one truth. The price of power was always higher than anyone wanted to admit. And when the lights dimmed and the cheers faded, many of those men were left with nothing but the wreckage of what their bodies once were. The hidden cost of a sport obsessed with strength. It forgets that every superhero eventually returns to being human. Success has a strange way of hiding what it costs. When the San Francisco 49ers became the dominant force of the late 1980s, they seemed untouchable, elegant, efficient, almost divine in precision. They weren't just a football team. They were a vision of how the game should be played. Bill Walsh's West Coast offense revolutionized strategy. Joe Montana's calm, redefined clutch, and Jerry Rice's perfection set the standard for greatness itself. To the public, they were football's cathedral, the polished, corporate, disciplined counterpoint to the chaos of teams like the Raiders or Bears. But behind that clean, golden image, power was quietly tearing at the seams. Greatness, as it turned out, came with shadows of its own control battles, egos, and secrets that would shape not only the dynasty's destiny, but the very culture of professional football. The 49ers story was one of contradiction. On Sundays, they embodied poise and genius. Behind closed doors, they were a battlefield of ambition. The late 1980s were an age of image-making in the NFL, a time when success wasn't just measured in wins, but in how clean those wins appeared. The 49ers were the perfect poster team, Silicon Valley's favorite sons, champions of efficiency, technology, and progress. But perfection has a way of hiding its imperfections. Bill Walsh, known as the genius, was more than a coach. He was an architect of human systems. His players were trained to think like machines, to operate with precision down to the millisecond. Every route was timed, every motion choreographed, every throw calculated. But the same mind that engineered beauty also fostered fragility. Walsh was notoriously controlling, a perfectionist haunted by the smallest flaws. His drive to maintain dominance created a culture of quiet tension, a team always at war with its own expectations. Inside the organization, whispers circulated of burnout, exhaustion, and emotional breakdowns. Walsh's methods, while brilliant, demanded submission. Players who couldn't keep up mentally or emotionally were discarded quickly. He once admitted that his biggest challenge was on designing plays. It was keeping human beings from collapsing under the weight of his vision. "You have to play with your mind," he told his team, "but the mind can betray you." Even Joe Montana, the face of grace under pressure, wasn't immune. His battles with Walsh became legendary, not public feuds, but cold wars of pride and control. Montana was Walsh's creation, yet he was also his mirror, calm on the outside, but internally burning to prove his independence. Their relationship defined the paradox of the dynasty. Two men who needed each other to achieve perfection, yet quietly resented how much of themselves they had to surrender to maintain it. Then came Steve Young, the heir apparent. His arrival deepened the fissures within the team. Young was younger, faster, and a threat to the established order. Walsh saw him as the future. Montana saw him as betrayal. The locker room split into factions, veterans loyal to Montana's quiet leadership and younger players drawn to Young's energy. The 49ers' dominance continued on the field, but beneath it was a storm waiting to break. While their public image remained spotless, the front office became a theater of manipulation. Walsh, who prided himself on intellect and innovation, grew increasingly isolated from ownership and management. The stress broke him down. After the 1988 season, another Super Bowl victory, Walsh abruptly retired, citing exhaustion. Few knew how close he was to collapse. He later described it as being consumed by the machine I built. But even in retirement, the machinery kept moving. George Seifert took over, and the 49ers continued to win. The 1989 team was arguably the most complete in football history. Montana in his prime, Rice in his zenith, and a defense as disciplined as their offense was brilliant. To outsiders, it looked like a seamless transition. Inside, it was a facade. Walsh's influence still haunted every decision. His system still dictated every move. His ghost still whispered over every play call. As the team won Super Bowl 24 in a 55-10 demolition of the Denver Broncos, the public saw invincibility. What they didn't see were the cracks forming beneath. Players spoke of internal pressure that bordered on obsession. The fear of being the one to break perfection kept men awake at night. Walsh's playbook had become gospel, but gospel by nature demands faith, and blind faith often comes with a cost. And then, as the dynasty aged, the scandals began to surface. Some were small players, quietly disciplined for off-field conduct. Locker room rifts, buried by public relations teams. Others were larger whispers of performance-enhancing substances, sideline conflicts, and manipulation within the organization. The 49ers were learning a truth every empire eventually faces. The higher the pedestal, the more fragile the balance. In the early 1990s, the cracks widened. Montana's injuries forced the inevitable. Steve Young became the starter. Fans were divided. The press painted the transition as a noble passing of the torch, but inside the locker room, it was a mutiny disguised as progress. Montana's quiet dignity couldn't conceal his heartbreak. When he was traded to Kansas City, it wasn't just a roster move, it was the end of an era. The franchise that had built its identity on loyalty and unity had devoured its own. Yet even in turmoil, the 49ers kept winning. That was their paradox. Scandal, ego, and betrayal couldn't stop them. It only seemed to fuel them. They had become the embodiment of the league's greatest illusion, that success absolves sin. The 49ers didn't escape their flaws. They simply outran them. Their dynasty became a metaphor for the NFL itself, brilliant, beautiful, but ruthlessly efficient at burying its imperfections. They showed that the modern football empire could be as political as it was athletic, as psychological as it was physical. Beneath the poetry of their offense was a machine built on control, silence, and emotional sacrifice. And perhaps that's why their legacy endures. The 49ers didn't just dominate, they defined how to dominate. They taught the league that image could be managed, that scandal could be softened, that perfection was not about purity, but presentation. They were the first team to truly master the politics of modern sports celebrity. Every franchise that came after them, from the Patriots to the Chiefs, owes a debt to San Francisco's Golden Empire. They weren't just champions of the field, they were architects of how success could coexist with secrecy. They proved that as long as the product was perfect, the process could remain hidden. But every dynasty, no matter how graceful, carries ghosts. The perfection that made the 49ers untouchable also made them human. Walsh's burnout, Montana's exile, and the quiet disillusionment of players who lived inside the machine. These were the unspoken prices of glory. In the end, the 49ers' brilliance wasn't just in what they built, but in how they concealed the human cost beneath it. Their glory was real. But behind the curtain, it was always fragile, a dynasty held together by control, silence, and the unrelenting fear of falling from grace. And perhaps that's what makes their story timeless. The realization that even in perfection, redemption is never far away, because the moment you stop fighting for it, everything collapses. They called them America's team, and in many ways, that title became both their crown and their curse. The Dallas Cowboys were not just a football franchise. They were a spectacle, a business empire, and a mirror of America's contradictions. Glorious, yet flawed. Ambitious, yet self-destructive. Under the bright Texas lights, the Cowboys mastered what few teams ever could, turning scandal into spectacle, chaos into brand identity, and dysfunction into dynasty. By the time Jerry Jones bought the team in 1989, the Cowboys were a relic of former greatness. Tom Landry's quiet discipline had faded into obsolescence, and Texas Stadium had lost its mythic glow. Jones, a former oilman with the charm of a salesman and the cunning of a gambler, walked into the league like a storm. His first move was sacrilege, firing Landry, the man who built the franchise. It was the kind of ruthless act that drew gasps across the league, but Jones didn't flinch. He wasn't there to preserve history, he was there to own it. And with that, the Cowboys entered their new era, one where business and football became inseparable. Jones wasn't just a team owner, he was a brand visionary. He saw football not as a sport, but as a television product, a cultural export. Under his leadership, the Cowboys became the NFL's first true global commodity, a logo as recognizable as Coca-Cola, a spectacle that blended gladiator violence with Hollywood glamour. But every empire demands a cost. When Jones hired Jimmy Johnson, his old college teammate and a man as brash as he was brilliant, it was the perfect marriage of ego and ambition. Johnson built a machine on youth, speed, and swagger. The early 1990s Cowboys were fearless, ruthless, and dangerously good. Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, and Michael Irvin, they weren't just stars. They were icons of a new era. They represented the rebirth of Dallas, loud, confident, and unapologetic. On the field, they were pure execution. Off it, they were chaos wrapped in charisma. Their rise to power was meteoric. 3 Super Bowl wins in 4 years, a modern dynasty that resurrected the city's pride and redefined the NFL's image. But while America cheered, the cracks beneath the silver star deepened. The Cowboys' success wasn't just fueled by talent, it was driven by excess. Parties bled into practices. Headlines about drugs, arrests, and late-night escapades became as common as game highlights. Players lived like rock stars in shoulder pads. And Jones, he didn't just tolerate it, he monetized it. He understood something the rest of the league was too afraid to admit. Controversy sells. The Cowboys' chaos wasn't a liability, it was marketing gold. Every scandal, every arrest, every defiant quote kept them in the headlines. Dallas became the league's most watched soap opera, and America couldn't look away. The Cowboys didn't just dominate football, they dated attention. Still, success has a way of breeding resentment. Behind the scenes, the relationship between Jones and Johnson began to unravel. Two men who had once shared a vision now shared only contempt. Johnson wanted control over football decisions. Jones wanted credit for them. The tension exploded after the 1993 season, when Jones publicly hinted that any coach could win with this team. Johnson, proud and unbending, walked away. In the blink of an eye, the most successful partnership in modern football collapsed under the weight of ego. It was a fracture that symbolized the Cowboys themselves, too powerful for their own good. When Barry Switzer replaced Johnson, the locker room descended further into indulgence. Stories emerged of wild parties at the White House, a rented home where players escaped media. Scrutiny to indulge in cocaine, alcohol, and escorts. The culture of winning had mutated into one of entitlement. The Cowboys were untouchable, and they knew it. Yet, even in chaos, they found a way to keep winning. In 1995, the Cowboys captured their third Super Bowl of the decade, proof that talent and audacity could coexist with scandal, at least for a while. But by the late 1990s, the bill came due. The dynasty began to rot from within. Arrests piled up, discipline vanished, and the team that once embodied perfection became a case study in self-destruction. Michael Irvin's off-field troubles symbolized the fall. His brilliance on the field was unquestioned, but his off-field spiral, involving drugs, altercations, and accusations, became tabloid fuel. Irvin wasn't the only one. Star players were arrested for everything from assault to drug possession. The Cowboys' locker room became less a team and more a collection of egos orbiting Jerry Jones' gravitational pull. Jones, for his part, refused to apologize. He called it the price of doing business in the spotlight. In his mind, control over the Cowboys wasn't about morality. It was about ownership. Every decision, every controversy, every triumph ultimately pointed back to him. And yet, that paradox was the secret to the Cowboys' mythology. They were never just a team. They were a reflection of America's appetite for redemption and ruin. The public condemned them, but they still tuned in. Every Sunday, fans across the country watched, not just for the touchdowns, but for the drama. The Cowboys made football cinematic, a fusion of triumph and tabloid, discipline and debauchery. Through all of it, the franchise remained profitable, powerful, and relevant. Even as the 2000s arrived without championships, the Cowboys still reigned as the NFL's most valuable team. Scandal couldn't kill them. It made them immortal. They had become a symbol of America's cultural DNA. We punish the sinner then by their jersey. And that's the paradox. For every fall from grace, there was resurrection. For every scandal, a comeback story. From Quincy Carter's collapse to Tony Romo's heartbreak to Dak Prescott's quiet rise, the Cowboys continued to reinvent themselves. Jones understood the modern truth better than anyone. In a world built on attention, morality is negotiable, but relevance is not. Even now, decades after the dynasty ended, the Cowboys remain America's obsession. Every season begins with prophecy and ends with postmortem. They are both loved and hated, mocked and worshipped. Their brand thrives on contradiction. Failure sold as destiny, dysfunction rebranded as passion. And maybe that's why their story endures. Because the Cowboys never truly lost their soul. They simply learned to monetize it. Underneath the glitz and scandal, there as a core truth about what it means to survive in the NFL's unforgiving light. Image is currency, and chaos is power. Jerry Jones didn't just build a football team. He built an empire that feeds on its own drama. He turned scandal into spectacle, excess into entertainment, and dysfunction into identity. In doing so, he made the Cowboys eternal. They are the embodiment of the NFL's moral paradox, proof that greatness and guilt can coexist, that redemption can come wrapped in scandal, and that sometimes the most flawed heroes are the ones who define a nation's game. And every time the lights go up in AT&T Stadium, that modern cathedral of spectacle and excess, you can still feel it. The ghosts of the 1990s dynasty, the echoes of chaos, the hum of America's favorite contradiction. The Cowboys story isn't about purity, it's about persistence, the art of surviving your own legend. The New Orleans Saints were supposed to be the miracle story. The team that carried a broken city on its shoulders. The team that turned tragedy into triumph. In 2009, when they won their first Super Bowl, it wasn't just a victory for football, it was a resurrection for New Orleans. Just 4 years removed from Hurricane Katrina, the Superdome had transformed from a symbol of despair into a cathedral of redemption. The Saints weren't merely playing for a championship, they were playing for rebirth. But what happens when the Saints aren't so saintly? By 2012, the very franchise that had given the city its hope was at the center of one of the darkest scandals in NFL history, a scandal that forced the league and the nation to question what winning had truly come to mean. It was called Bountygate. The concept seemed simple, almost primal, a locker room incentive program where defensive players earned cash bonuses for injuring opponents, $1,000 for a cart-off, more for a knockout hit. It was the kind of rumor that had long existed in football's underground, whispered among linemen, passed down from an older generation that still worshipped at the altar of violence. But for the Saints, it became something more organized, more deliberate, and infinitely more dangerous. When the NFL's investigation went public, it was a shockwave that tore through the sport. Commissioner Roger Goodell called it a systematic, intentional effort to inflict injury. Defensive coordinator Greg Williams, a man known for his aggression and intensity, was accused of running the program. Head coach Sean Payton, beloved in New Orleans, was suspended for an entire season. General manager Mickey Loomis faced his own ban, and the franchise was fined $500,000, stripped of draft picks, and shamed before the world. The league wanted to make an example out of them. Because Bountygate wasn't just about money, it was about morality, about the thin line between motivation and malice. In the modern NFL, where concussions and long-term injuries had already ignited a national conversation about player safety, the idea of a reward system for harm felt almost medieval. The Saints, the team that had rebuilt a city, were suddenly portrayed as villains. Their Super Bowl legacy, their fairy tale story, all of it was now tainted by the perception that they had won not through resilience, but through brutality. For the players, it was a nightmare. Jonathan Vilma, the team's captain and defensive leader, was accused of offering $10,000 to any player who could knock Brett Favre out of the NFC Championship game. Vilma denied it, fiercely and publicly, even filing a defamation lawsuit against Goodell. Other players, including Will Smith, Anthony Hargrove, and Scott Fujita, faced suspensions. The NFL had drawn its battle lines, and the Saints found themselves fighting not just for their reputation, but for their humanity. Behind the headlines, though, the truth was murkier. Many former players argued that the bounty system, or something like it, had existed in one form or another across multiple teams. It wasn't a Saints invention. It was football's dirty secret, now dragged into the light. Greg Williams himself, in a leaked locker room recording before a 2012 playoff game, had said things that made the public recoil. Kill the head, the body will die. To players, it was motivational hyperbole, locker room bravado. To the outside world, it was proof of sanctioned violence. The contrast was devastating. A city that had once watched its team become a symbol of hope now saw them branded as moral outlaws. The national media turned the Saints' triumph into a cautionary tale about hubris and ethics. Talk shows debated whether they should forfeit their Super Bowl win. Fans burned jerseys. Sponsors distanced themselves. But inside New Orleans, the story was more complicated. The people of that city knew struggle. They knew redemption wasn't clean. To them, the Saints weren't villains, they were family. They had given the city something no storm or scandal could take away: belief. And so when the league came down hard, the fans doubled down harder. The free Sean Payton shirts, the US against the world banners, the chants in the French Quarter. The scandal, in a strange way, reignited the city's bond with its team. Because in New Orleans, survival isn't about being spotless. It's about enduring the stain and fighting anyway. When Sean Payton returned in 2013, after serving his year-long suspension, he wasn't greeted with shame. He was welcomed like a conquering hero. The fans forgave him because they understood him. His crime wasn't cruelty, 'twas competitiveness, an obsessive drive to win in a league that rewards ruthlessness but punishes transparency. That return season became a statement. Payton rebuilt the culture from within, instilling discipline without losing edge. Drew Brees, the face of the franchise, played with quiet vengeance, leading the team back to contention. They didn't win another Super Bowl that year, but they did something more profound. They regained their soul. Over time, the Saints scandal faded from the headlines. Buried beneath new controversies, deflated footballs, stolen signals, performance-enhancing drugs, the NFL moved on. But in New Orleans, the lesson lingered. The Saints story had always been about duality, faith, and failure, tragedy and triumph. Atika didn't destroy that legacy, it deepened it. It forced the franchise and the league itself to confront uncomfortable truths about what winning really costs. Football has always walked the line between art and violence. It sells beauty packaged in brutality. And for decades, the league encouraged aggression while pretending to condemn it. The Saints were punished for what others quietly practiced. They were the unlucky ones caught with the mask off. But they turned that punishment into purpose. By the late 2010s, when Drew Brees and Sean Payton led the team into another stretch of dominance, the Saints had transformed their image again. They became symbols of perseverance. The team that refused to stay buried even when the league tried to define them by scandal. Their victories were cleaner, but their drive remained the same. Prove everyone wrong. When Brees retired, his legacy stood untarnished. His partnership with Payton became one of the most celebrated in NFL history. Proof that redemption in football, like in life, isn't about erasing the past, but about outlasting it. The Saints' redemption didn't come in the form of another Lombardi trophy. It came through resilience, through the quiet rebuilding of trust between a city and its heroes. They had gone from America's darlings to its villains, and somehow they came out more human. The scandal that once defined them now served as a scar, a reminder that greatness often leaves marks. The Saints taught the league something it didn't want to admit. Morality in football is a moving target. What's condemned one year is celebrated the next, depending on who's winning. And maybe that's the real soul of the NFL. A place where faith and fury coexist, where the line between hero and sinner blurs every Sunday. The Saints were punished for what football has always been: violent, emotional, and deeply human. But in facing that reckoning, they became something greater than champions. They became a symbol of survival, not of innocence, but of endurance. In the end, Bountygate didn't break New Orleans. It revealed it. A city that had rebuilt itself from floodwaters knew how to weather shame. The Saints didn't have to be perfect to be loved. They just had to keep fighting. Because in the NFL, redemption isn't found in glory. It's found in getting up after the world calls you guilty. They weren't just a football team, they were an empire. For 2 decades, the New England Patriots ruled the NFL with an iron precision that bordered on mechanical. Under Bill Belichick and Tom Brady, they became the embodiment of control, of perfection measured in inches, seconds, and silent discipline. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of excellence, their dynasty was shadowed by controversy. From Spygate to Deflategate, they stood accused of bending the rules to maintain their reign. To their detractors, they were cheaters. To their loyalists, they were masters of adaptation. But to everyone, they were undeniable. In the early 2000s, As America's cultural landscape shifted toward instant gratification and reality television, the Patriots were building something colder, a football version of the Roman legion. There were no theatrics, no bravado, no visible emotion. Belichick's press conferences were symphonies of monotone brevity. And Brady, though polished and polite, radiated a different kind of intensity, an obsession with proving that control could conquer chaos. And yet, for all their dominance, whispers of suspicion always followed them. Spygate was the first crack in their armor. In 2007, the Patriots were accused of videotaping the New York Jets' defensive signals from an unauthorized location. It was a violation of league rules, small in scope, enormous in symbolism. The NFL fined Belichick $500,000, fined the team another $250,000, and stripped them of a first-round draft pick. To outsiders, it confirmed their suspicions. The Patriots didn't teach just outplay opponents. They outmaneuvered them by any means necessary. Belichick's response was measured, unapologetic, and cold. He called it a misinterpretation of the rules, an explanation that sounded less like denial and more like defiance. His message was clear. This was football, not morality play. In his world, control was the highest virtue, and anything that maintained it was justifiable. And then came the vengeance. In the very same season that their reputation was supposedly tarnished, the Patriots unleashed one of the greatest offensive assaults in NFL history. Brady threw 50 touchdown passes. Randy Moss caught 23 of them. They went 16-0 in the regular season, a feat of absolute domination. It was as if Spygate had only sharpened their blade. The Patriots didn't hide from controversy. They consumed it, metabolized it, and transformed it into momentum. Even their eventual Super Bowl loss to the Giants that year didn't feel like a defeat so much as a humanizing moment. For years, they had been criticized for being robotic. That loss showed the nation that perfection, even when pursued relentlessly, had a breaking point. But perfection, once tasted, becomes an addiction. 7 years later, Deflategate would reawaken the nation's obsession with the Patriots' morality. After the 2014 AFC Championship game, reports surfaced that the team had used underinflated footballs, allegedly making them easier to grip in cold conditions. The difference was marginal, almost laughably minute. Yet, it became a national scandal. Headlines screamed. Pundits debated physics. Scientists wrote essays. And through it all, the Patriots stood once again at the intersection of dominance and distrust. For Tom Brady, Deflategate became personal. He was suspended for 4 games, accused of knowing about or perhaps orchestrating the ball deflation. To many fans, it seemed absurd that a player of Brady's caliber, a man whose preparation bordered on obsessive compulsion, would need such an edge. But in the public's imagination, the Patriots had already been typecast as manipulators of the system. Whether guilty or not, their reputation ensured judgment. Brady's response was surgical. He didn't rage publicly. He didn't plead. He prepared. When he returned from suspension in 2016, he delivered a season that felt biblical in its retribution. That year as Super Bowl, the 28-3 comeback against the Atlanta Falcons became more than a victory. It was a resurrection. The kind of performance that transcended scandal, have forced even their harshest critics to acknowledge something deeper. You can question the methods, but you cannot deny the mastery. Belichick and Brady had, in their own way, turned scandal into fuel. For them, controversy wasn't a threat. It was a psychological weapon. It narrowed focus. It forged unity. Inside the Patriots locker room, the outside noise was transformed into identity. They weren't cheaters. They were survivors of scrutiny. They were the most analyzed, dissected, and hated team in football, and that hatred became their advantage. While other franchises wilted under scandal, the Patriots evolved. Their system thrived on consistency, routine, and adaptation. Players came and went, but the core philosophy remained immutable. Do your job. No distractions, no individuality, no excuses. That ethos wasn't just discipline, it was doctrine. Even after the departures of stars, after Moss, after Welker, after countless coordinators, the machine kept humming. Each scandal that was supposed to destroy them only seemed to refine them. Like pressure forging steel. It's easy to forget now, but the Patriots dynasty spanned nearly 2 generations. 6 Super Bowl victories between 2001 and 2018. 9 total appearances. A record so staggering that it redefined what dominance meant in the modern NFL. No team had ever maintained control that long, and yet their relationship with controversy never disappeared. It became part of their mythology. Opponents called them arrogant, fans called them brilliant. But both agreed on one thing: no team managed pressure like New England. Belichick's genius wasn't just strategy, it was psychological warfare. He understood that control wasn't just about play calling, it was about narrative. By refusing to engage, by embracing silence, he disarmed the media. His monotone interviews, his blank expressions, they weren't indifference. They were command. He dictated what the public could feel, what the players could think, and what the league could never quite predict. And Brady, in his own way, was his perfect counterpart. The image of order and precision, a quarterback whose mind operated like an algorithm. But beneath that calm exterior burned a defiance that matched Belichick's cold control. Every accusation, every slight, every whispered doubt became kindling. When he left New England in 2020 and won another Super Bowl with Tampa Bay, it didn't feel like a separation. It felt like an expansion. He had internalized the Patriots code, refined it, and carried it into new territory. The Patriots story is more than a collection of victories. It's a study in the psychology of power, how sustained excellence invites scrutiny, how scrutiny breeds obsession, and how obsession, when harnessed, can become the most potent form of motivation. They thrived not in spite of scandal, but because of it. For all the investigations, the fines, and the headlines, their real secret was simpler: control. Not just over the game, but over themselves. In a sport defined by chaos, by violent collisions, and unpredictable outcomes, the Patriots engineered predictability. Every play, every response, every emotion was calculated. Even their silence was strategy. To the outside world, it looked inhuman. To those inside, it was freedom, the freedom to dominate without distraction. History will always debate whether the Patriots' success was pure or tainted. But to understand their legacy is to accept that greatness often emerges from imperfection. Belichick and Brady didn't chase victory. They mastered the psychology of survival in a world that demanded both flawlessness and rebellion. Their empire was not built on morality, it was built on mastery. And even now, years removed from their prime, the echo of that dominance lingers. The way they spoke, the way they played, the way they turned accusation into energy. In the end, their greatest innovation wasn't strategic, it was emotional. They proved that control, when absolute, can outlast chaos. In the story of scandal and redemption, the Patriots stand alone. Not as victims or villains, but as architects of their own mythology, proof that in the NFL, perfection is never clean, and power is never innocent. There are teams in NFL history that feel less like franchises and more like living, breathing organisms, pulsing with defiance, pride, and something darker that never quite fades. The Baltimore Ravens were born from controversy. Their very existence was a scandal, the result of a franchise move that ripped a city's heart out. When the Cleveland Browns packed up and vanished overnight in 1996, becoming the new Baltimore Ravens, the shockwaves went beyond football. Fans in Cleveland called it betrayal. Baltimore called it resurrection. Out of that rupture came a team that carried both guilt and opportunity, a second chance to define itself through dominance. But what came next wasn't clean redemption. It was a kind of rebirth that demanded blood, sweat, and silence. The Ravens were not built to charm. They were built to hit, to intimidate, to make quarterbacks question their career choices. When you look at the history of this team, one thing becomes clear. Their identity was forged in chaos, defined by controversy, and perfected through control of it. Ray Lewis became the embodiment of that paradox. A linebacker who played like a man chasing absolution. When he entered the league in 1996, he wasn't just a defensive player. He was a force of nature, but destiny had already written him into one of the darkest chapters of NFL history. In 2000, just as the Ravens were preparing for what would become one of the most dominant defensive seasons ever recorded, Lewis found himself at the center of a murder investigation. 2 men were dead after a Super Bowl party in Atlanta. Blood was found on Lewis's suit. For weeks, the story was everywhere. News tickers, sports radio, courtroom steps. The NFL's moral authority was under siege. The league had seen scandals before: drugs, gambling, hidden injuries, but never had one of its brightest stars been so publicly tied to something this primal. Lewis eventually struck a plea deal, admitting to obstruction of justice, not murder. He testified against his companions. He was fined by the league, but he wasn't suspended. He returned to the field like a man possessed. That season, the Ravens' defense allowed just 165 points, the fewest in the 16-game era. They shut out opponents, choked offenses, and broke records. And when they lifted the Lombardi Trophy, it felt less like a celebration and more like an exorcism. That's the paradox that defines Baltimore. S redemption story. Greatness achieved under the shadow of something the world could never forget. The fans embraced Lewis, not in spite of his past, but because of how he carried it. He never ran from the scandal. He used it as armor. Every pregame dance, every scream in the tunnel, every sermon on the sidelines felt like a man trying to rewrite his soul in front of millions. In the years that followed, Baltimore became a city of defense, discipline, and defiance. Their brand wasn't sleek or flashy. It was violent, methodical, almost biblical in its sense of judgment. "We don't apologize for who we are," Lewis once said in a locker room interview. "We hit you, we make you feel it. And when you get up, we hit you again." That wasn't just football talk. It was the spiritual DNA of a franchise that refused to be pitied. The Ravens front office mirrored that intensity. General Manager Ozzie Newsome, a man of quiet authority, understood that redemption wasn't about image, it was about consistency. He built the roster like a defense attorney assembling evidence, line by line, player by player. Ed Reed, the cerebral assassin of the secondary. Terrell Suggs, the embodiment of raw aggression. Together, they made Baltimore's defense an institution, not just a unit, but a cultural statement. And yet, every time the Ravens rose, the ghost of scandal followed. The whispers about Lewis never vanished. His Super Bowl MVP speech in 2001 was both triumph and testimony. A man trying to explain to the world that redemption doesn't erase history. It rewrites it through action. Over the years, fans learned to live with that duality. In Baltimore, forgiveness wasn't granted by words. It was earned every Sunday through violence controlled within 60 minutes. The team's redemption wasn't linear. In 2011, when the Ravens lost the AFC Championship after a dropped touchdown and a missed field goal, it felt like a cruel echo of the past, a reminder that destiny never arrives cleanly. But the following year, as Ray Lewis announced his retirement, the story came full circle. The 2012 Ravens were not the most dominant team statistically, but they were emotionally invincible. When Lewis returned from injury during that playoff run, it wasn't just a comeback, it was closure. Then came the blackout in New Orleans, Super Bowl 47. The lights went out midway through the game. For 34 minutes, the world sat in eerie silence, waiting. It felt poetic, the darkness returning one last time before the story's end. When the lights came back, the Ravens held on. They won. Ray Lewis retired on top. The man who had entered the league under suspicion left as a two-time champion and future Hall of Famer. But even in their redemption, controversy found its way back. In 2014, the franchise faced new scandal. This time, not from players, but from leadership. The Ray Rice domestic violence case reopened the league's moral wounds. The elevator footage, the mishandled punishment, the public backlash, it all resurrected the same question. How does a league that glorifies violence decide where its limits are? For the Ravens, it was a painful reckoning. They released Rice, condemned the act, and spoke of reform. But the damage was done. Still, Baltimore did what it always did. It rebuilt. The city, scarred but unbroken, found new life through Lamar Jackson, a quarterback who redefined what leadership could look like. With him, the Ravens began a new era, one less about vengeance and more about vision. Beneath every highlight reel, there's a heartbeat that remembers where it all started. The scandal that once threatened to destroy them became the soil from which they grew their greatest strength: resilience. When I think about the Ravens story, I don't see just a football team. I see a parable. A meditation on how redemption in sports mirrors redemption in life. It doesn't come from public approval or record books. It comes from waking up every day and facing the same demons you thought you buried. It's knowing that no matter how far you run, the shadows follow, but so does the light if you keep moving. Baltimore taught the NFL something it didn't want to learn: that scandal doesn't always destroy champions. Sometimes it creates them. Sometimes it teaches them to play harder, hit smarter, and lead deeper. And when the crowd fades and the silence returns, the echoes of that journey still linger in the air, not as guilt, but as proof that redemption, in its rawest form, is never about forgetting. It's about fighting your way back until history runs out of reasons to doubt you. Some franchises seem cursed, not by fate, but by themselves, forever chasing the idea of greatness through storms of their own creation. The Philadelphia Eagles have always carried that kind of tension. A blue-collar city. A fan base that bleeds green but demands perfection. A franchise that, for decades, had all the ingredients of victory but kept finding new ways to fall apart. To understand the Eagles' 2017 redemption story, you have to understand what came before it. Decades of heartbreak, internal conflict, and chaos that made triumph not just unlikely, but almost mythic. Philadelphia was never an easy place to play. The city doesn't allow idols without proof. Booing Santa Claus became a national punchline. But it wasn't about disrespect, it was about standards. Eagles fans don't worship their heroes, they test them. They measure heart and grit, not highlight reels. For years, that edge mirrored the locker room talented teams that looked ready to rise, only to implode under the weight of ego, pressure, or sheer bad luck. Under head coach Andy Reid, the Eagles of the early 2000s were perennial contenders. Donovan McNabb, Brian Dawkins, Terrell Owens, those names defined a generation. But so did the friction. McNabb and Owens' feud in 2005 turned a Super Bowl-caliber roster into a soap opera. What could have been a dynasty crumbled under distrust. And when Reid's tenure ended after 14 years without a ring, the city was left with a bitter taste. Respect for consistency, regret for incompletion. Then came the era of Chip Kelly, the supposed revolutionary. His up-tempo offense, his scientific approach to nutrition and recovery, his obsession with control. It worked briefly until it didn't. The locker room soured. Star players like LaShawn McCoy and Deshaun Jackson were traded. The team became less about unity and more about obedience. Kelly's downfall wasn't just tactical, it was emotional. He misread the soul of the city. Philadelphia doesn't want a lab experiment, it wants heart. By 2016, the Eagles were fractured again, a city divided between cynicism and hope. And then, quietly, something began to change. Doug Peterson, a former backup quarterback, soft-spoken but stubborn, took took over as head coach. Carson Wentz, a rookie from North Dakota, arrived without fanfare but with quiet confidence for the first time in years. The Eagles weren't trying to be something they weren't. They embraced who they were, a collection of overlooked, undervalued, and underappreciated men. The 2017 season didn't start with destiny in mind, but week by week, the improbable began to take shape. Wentz played like a man with divine timing, throwing touchdowns that defied geometry, turning broken plays into symphonies of chaos. The locker room buzzed with belief. Veterans like Jason Kelce and Malcolm Jenkins anchored the culture, while role players like Corey Clement and Nelson Aguilar found their rhythm. For once, everything aligned. Then, it all fell apart. In Week 14, against the Rams, Wentz tore his ACL, diving for a touchdown. The team's miracle season was supposed to die right there, but it didn't. Out of the chaos stepped Nick Foles, a quarterback who had been written off, traded away, nearly retired. When he returned to Philadelphia, it was as a backup, a safety net. Yet destiny, it seems, loves irony. Under Foles, the Eagles became something different. Not flashier, not more talented, but freer. The team loosened its shoulders, trusted its system, and rallied around a simple mantra: we all we got, we all we need. Every Sunday, they carried that underdog identity like armor. When analysts laughed, they barked back, literally. The underdog mask became a symbol. The team wore it proudly, a reminder that no one believed in them but themselves. The playoffs were a gauntlet of disbelief. Against Atlanta, the defense held the line. Against Minnesota, they exploded Foles, playing the game of his life. And then, it came. Super Bowl 52. The New England Patriots, the dynasty of discipline and dominance, standing across the field. The contrast couldn't have been sharper: order versus improvisation, legacy versus chaos. What happened that night in Minneapolis didn't just rewrite Eagles history, it redefined how chaos could lead to clarity. Foles, the backup, outdueled Brady in one of the greatest offensive displays ever witnessed on football's biggest stage. Philly special, that trick play became more than a moment. It became scripture. A play that embodied the fearlessness of a team that refused to bow to logic. But beneath the glory, there was something deeper, a current of humility and defiance intertwined. After the win, when Foles held the Lombardi Trophy and thanked God, the crowd didn't just cheer for victory. They cheered for redemption, for every near miss, every heartbreak, every year of being the punchline. Philadelphia finally had its ring. But more importantly, it had its identity restored. Still, true to form, the chaos returned. In the years that followed, the Eagles' unity cracked again. Wentz's decline, the coaching carousel, the internal whispers about leadership and trust. It was déjà vu. The team that had found perfection in imperfection began to drift. But the legacy of that 2017 run didn't vanish. It remained a blueprint, proof that greatness doesn't require serenity. It can rise from noise, from friction, from belief forged in doubt. Malcolm Jenkins once said, "You don't have to be best friends to win. You just have to believe in the same fight." That's the Eagles' truth. They never were a team of saints. They were a team of survivors. Every argument, every setback, every misstep became kindling for one perfect fire. When I think about that championship, I don't just see the confetti or the parade on Broad Street. I see a city exhaling decades of pain. I see grown men crying in parking lots. I see the kind of joy that can only come from enduring chaos long enough to earn peace. That season wasn't just about football. It was about the psychology of resilience. About what happens when a group of flawed men decide that their flaws don't disqualify them, but define them. The Eagles taught the league that sometimes the most unified teams aren't the most peaceful ones. Sometimes, true chemistry is built in argument and tested in loss. Their victory wasn't neat or corporate or polished. It was messy, human, and utterly unforgettable. In the end, the 2017 Eagles didn't just win a Super Bowl. They proved that chaos isn't the enemy of greatness. It's often the forge where greatness is born. Legacy in Pittsburgh has always meant something heavier than wins or trophies. It's about lineage, a chain that stretches from the steel mills to the stadium. From the city's working-class backbone to the black and gold uniforms that have come to symbolize an entire identity. The Pittsburgh Steelers aren't just a football team. They are a generational inheritance. Fathers handed the team down 2 sons, mothers 2 daughters, and grandparents 2 grandchildren. For decades, they've been the living embodiment of blue-collar pride. But even a legacy as sturdy as Pittsburgh's has been tested by scandal, by moral reckoning, by the collision between tradition and modernity. When you talk about the Steelers, you talk about the Rooney family, the architects of consistency, loyalty, and principle in a sport that rarely rewards either. The Rooney Rule, instituted in 2003, was born from their vision, a mandate requiring teams to interview minority candidates for head coaching and senior operations positions. It wasn't a PR gesture. It was a statement of responsibility, a recognition that the game had to reflect the country it entertained. Dan Rooney didn't just change the Steelers, they helped change the NFL. But the irony of legacy is that it's most visible in crisis. And for the Steelers, maintaining integrity wasn't about avoiding scandal. It was about surviving it without losing their soul. The first modern storm hit in the mid-2000s. The Steelers were riding high, fresh off a Super Bowl victory under Bill Cowher. A new generation led by Ben Roethlisberger at quarterback. He was the heir apparent to the long line of Pittsburgh greats. Bradshaw, Harris, Green, Lambert. A player with raw power and poise, tailor-made for the city's rough-edged heart. But in 2010, everything changed. 2 separate allegations of sexual assault against Roethlisberger shook the franchise to its foundation. Though no criminal charges were filed, the damage was undeniable. The league suspended him for violating the NFL's personal conduct policy. For a team that prided itself on discipline and moral fiber, this was more than a PR disaster. It was a crisis of identity. Fans were split. Some defended their quarterback, citing due process. Others saw betrayal not just of trust, but of the values Pittsburgh claimed to uphold. Inside the organization, the Rooneys faced a question no dynasty wants to ask. How do you protect your culture when its cornerstone cracks? They didn't issue spin or deflection. They stood firm, demanded accountability, and forced the face of their franchise to earn back respect. Roethlisberger did, to his credit, rebuild his image slowly through charity, humility, and by avoiding further controversy. But the scar never disappeared entirely. That period marked a shift, not just for Pittsburgh, but for the NFL as a whole. The league could no longer pretend that personal morality and professional performance lived in separate worlds. Fans demanded transparency. Media scrutiny deepened. Every misstep became a headline. And through it all, the Steelers continued to walk the tightrope. The balance between forgiveness and standards, between winning and doing it the right way. Then came a different kind of test, the cultural one. The anthem protests of 2016 and 2017 forced every franchise to confront the collision of sport, politics, and identity. For Pittsburgh, the controversy reached its boiling point in 2017, when the entire team stayed in the tunnel during the national anthem before a game against Chicago, except for one man, Alejandro Villanueva, a former Army Ranger who stood alone at the tunnel's edge, hand on heart. The image went viral instantly. To some, it was heroic. To others, divisive. The truth was more complex. The Steelers hadn't intended a protest. They had decided, as a team, to stay out of sight to avoid choosing sides in a politically charged moment. But the photograph fractured that intent. Suddenly, a team built on unity looked splintered. Mike Tomlin, the head coach, faced the cameras afterward, calm, measured, yet visibly frustrated. "We're not going to play politics," he said. "We're football players, not politicians." It was one of those rare moments when the weight of America's wider conflicts pressed directly into the NFL's most stable locker room. Yet, even that moment, as chaotic as it appeared, reflected what made the Steelers different. They didn't fracture completely. They regrouped. They talked it out internally. They owned their differences without letting them destroy their fabric. And in that, they showed what real integrity looks like. Not moral perfection, but collective resilience. But the years that followed would challenge even that. The Killer Bees era, Ben Roethlisberger, Antonio Brown, and Le'Veon Bell should have been the foundation of another dynasty. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about ego and ambition. Bell's contract disputes, Brown's public meltdowns, social media rants, and final exit in disgrace. It was chaos, the kind that corrodes trust from the inside. For an organization built on control, the Steelers suddenly looked human, vulnerable to the same internal collapse that had undone so many before them. The headlines became relentless. Critics wondered whether Tomlin had lost his locker room, whether the Rooney way was still relevant in an era dominated by player empowerment and instant celebrity. But quietly, without theatrics, Pittsburgh began to rebuild. Not through splashy signings or radical reinventions, but through something far simpler: stability. They didn't fire Tomlin. They didn't panic. They drafted wisely. They leaned into their identity, defense, discipline, and culture. While flashier teams burned bright and fast, the Steelers endured. And endurance, after all, is the truest mark of character. Even in moments of personal or public failure, the Steelers have remained what they've always been: a mirror for the sport itself. The franchise has seen every era of the NFL's evolution, from leather helmets to concussion protocols, from segregation to the Rooney Rule, from the golden age of defense to the analytics revolution. Through every change, they've stood for something bigger than the scoreboard. In 2020, when social justice protests swept the country, the Rooney legacy came full circle. The very rule that Dan Rooney had championed years before became a national conversation again. The NFL, under pressure to live up to its own promises, expanded the policy, adding requirements, accountability, and transparency. It was an acknowledgement that Rooney's vision had been right all along. The game can separate performance from principle. Looking back, the Steelers' story isn't about scandal avoidance. It's about scandal survival. About a team that learned to carry its flaws without letting them define it. For every controversy that hit Pittsburgh, from player misconduct to locker room politics, there was a counterweight of integrity, often unseen, but always present. And maybe that's what the Steelers have always represented best: not perfection, but balance. A city and a team that understands struggle, not as shame, but as part of the process. In Pittsburgh, they don't erase their past. They build over it. Every scandal becomes sediment, another layer of experience, another test of faith. And every time the noise threatens to drown them, they go back to their roots: work, unity, and an unspoken code that the game means more than the moment. In an age where headlines move faster than legacies can heal, the Steelers remain a reminder that some organizations just survive the dark. They adapt to it, and in doing so, define what endurance really means. In the fall of 2005, Minnesota Vikings found themselves not in the headlines for their playbook, but for something far darker. What began as a bye-week team bonding event spiraled into one of the most infamous scandals in NFL history, a night on Lake Minnetonka that would haunt the franchise for years. It wasn't about football that evening. It was about indulgence, arrogance, and the collapse of discipline. The Love Boat scandal, as it came to be known, didn't just expose personal misconduct. It tore open the fragile culture beneath the Vikings' purple and gold pride. A team searching for identity in an era when talent had outpaced integrity. The early 2000s Vikings were built on promise: Randy Moss, Daunt Culpepper, and a high-octane offense that could score from anywhere on the field. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, whispers of immaturity, ego, and entitlement. The team had flair, but lacked focus. It was a roster heavy with talent and light on accountability. The 2005 season was supposed to be a comeback year, a chance to reclaim the glory that had slipped through their fingers in the late 90s. Instead, it became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when fame outpaces discipline. The night on Lake Minnetonka was meant to be private, a chartered boat, a few teammates, and some entertainment. But the line between celebration and scandal was crossed almost instantly. Reports later described behavior that shocked even seasoned observers of professional sports: lewd acts in plain sight, alcohol-fueled chaos, and the presence of women flown in from out of state for the event. When the story broke, it hit like a thunderclap. The Vikings, once the quiet northern franchise defined by stoic football, suddenly found themselves the face of debauchery. Local headlines were merciless. Love Boat became late-night punchline fodder. Fans were humiliated. The team's leadership structure collapsed under the weight of the scandal. 4 players, including Culpepper and cornerback Fred Smoot, were charged with misdemeanors related to indecent conduct. The locker room fractured. Sponsors pulled back. The organization's credibility, hard-earned through decades of Midwestern grit, evaporated almost overnight. The fallout went beyond fines and court appearances. It forced a reckoning within the Vikings organization. Owner Ziggy Wilf, who had purchased the team just months earlier, was blindsided. But rather than dismiss the scandal as an isolated incident, he treated it as an existential threat. "That's not who we are," Wilf said at the time, his voice measured but sharp. It was a declaration of intent, not just to clean house, but to redefine the Vikings' identity. That rebuilding didn't happen quickly. It required dismantling the remnants of a culture that had tolerated too much and demanded too little. Mike Tice was replaced as head coach. The roster was overhauled. Players once seen as untouchable were traded or released. The message was clear. The Vikings would no longer confuse talent for character. And slowly, painfully, the franchise began to heal. By the time Mike Zimmer took over in 2014, the scars of Minnetonka still lingered in the public consciousness, but the organization itself had changed. Zimmer wasn't a politician or a showman. Okay, he was a grinder, a defensive mind forged in decades of hard coaching under Bill Parcells and others. He didn't sugarcoat failure. He demanded accountability from stars and rookies alike. In Zimmer's world, effort was currency. Excuses were debt. That mentality resonated in Minnesota. The Vikings, long a team defined by flash, became one built on discipline. Defense became their identity again, echoing the days of the Purple People Eaters. Players like Harrison Smith, Everson Griffin, and Danielle Hunter embodied a new code: physical dominance anchored by professionalism. Even when new controversies hit, like the brief turmoil surrounding Adrian Peterson's 2014 suspension for child abuse allegations, the organization handled it with a maturity that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. They didn't deflect. They didn't deny. They paused, faced the issue head-on, and cooperated fully with league policy. The standard was clear. The Vikings could be fierce competitors without abandoning ethics. By 2017, the transformation was complete. That season, the Vikings became the story of resilience. Case Keenum, a backup quarterback, led them on an improbable playoff run. The Minneapolis Miracle, Stefon Diggs' last-second touchdown against the Saints, wasn't just a football play. It was a metaphor for the franchise's resurrection. From the depths of scandal to the heights of redemption, the Vikings had rebuilt not just their team, but their moral foundation. The locker room that once embodied excess had become a sanctuary for discipline. Players talked openly about faith, family, and focus. The organization invested in community outreach, education, and charitable initiatives across Minnesota. When Wilf later said, "We're proud not just of how our players perform, but who they are," it wasn't marketing, It was earned truth. The NFL is a league where memory fades fast. New controversies replace old ones. But some stains linger, and some transformations matter more because of where they began. The Vikings' road back from humiliation wasn't linear. There were losing seasons, front office changes, heartbreaks, but no relapse into chaos. Their revival was quieter than their fall, but more enduring. The irony is that the Love Boat scandal, in all its ugliness, became the turning point that restored purpose. It forced Minnesota to confront what many franchises avoid, the culture beneath the scoreboard. And in that confrontation, they rediscovered their roots, toughness, accountability, and humility. Today, when fans pack US Bank Stadium, few think about Lake Minnetonka. The noise, the light, the purple wave, it's all about pride. But underneath that pride lies an unspoken lesson. Greatness isn't just measured in banners or Pro Bowlers. It's measured in how a team carries itself when no one's watching. The Vikings' journey from scandal to respectability isn't glamorous. It doesn't fit neatly into highlight reels. But it's real. It's human. It's the story of men and an organization that refused to let disgrace define their legacy. What began as a night of reckless arrogance became a decade-long lesson in integrity. From those dark waters, the Vikings didn't just climb back to relevance. They emerged stronger, clearer, and more grounded than ever. For decades, the Washington franchise was more than a football team. It was an institution, once synonymous with pride, tradition, and Sunday dominance. It had become, by the 2010s, the face of something else entirely. Corporate rot, moral blindness, and unchecked ego. The story of the Washington Commanders is not one of a single scandal, but of an entire organizational culture collapsing under the weight of its own denial. The team's history carried weight. 3 Super Bowl titles. Joe Gibbs, the humble genius. The Hogs, the grit, the fans who bled burgundy and gold. Washington had once been the heartbeat of the NFC East. Physical, proud, relentless. But by the 2000s, that heartbeat began to falter, drowned in a cocktail of arrogance and dysfunction. When Daniel Snyder purchased the team in 1999, fans hoped his deep pockets would restore the glory days. Instead, he built a fortress of fear. What followed wasn't just mismanagement, it was a corporate empire rotting from within. Reports of toxicity were whispered for years. Executives ruled through intimidation. Cheerleaders spoke of being objectified and exploited. Employees described a culture where silence was survival and accountability was a myth. The stadium aged, the product on the field decayed, and yet Snyder's grip tightened. It began, as many downfalls do, with small cracks. Anonymous sources speaking to reporters about the worst workplace in the NFL. A revolving door of head coaches, general managers, and executives. The losing seasons became habitual, but the real damage was invisible. It was in the daily erosion of human dignity behind closed doors. Then came 2020, the year the dam finally broke. The Washington Post published an expose that sent shockwaves across the league. 15 women came forward, detailing years of sexual harassment and abuse within the organization. The accusations weren't vague. They were explicit, specific, and horrifying. Text messages, photos, an entire system of silence designed to protect power. The reports described an environment where executives openly degraded female employees, where boundaries were mocked, and where the team's leadership looked the other way or participated. The NFL, for years, had quietly tolerated Washington's dysfunction because money flowed and games were played. But this time, the outrage was too large to ignore. Commissioner Roger Goodell announced an independent investigation led by attorney Beth Wilkinson. For months, former employees spoke out, each story more damning than the last. The findings were so explosive that, in an unprecedented move, the NFL refused to release the full report publicly, a decision that would spark even more outrage. At the same time, Washington faced another reckoning, one tied to its very name. For decades, indigenous groups had protested the team's racial slur of a mascot, only to be dismissed. But in the summer of 2020, amid nationwide social justice movements and pressure from corporate sponsors, the franchise could no longer hide behind tradition. FedEx, Nike, and Pepsi, billion-dollar partners, threatened to walk away. Within days, the Redskins' name was retired. What had once been unthinkable happened almost overnight. The franchise was stripped down to its bones. The team, long defined by defiance, was finally forced to confront its own history. Not just the scandals of the present, but the sins of its past. The temporary rebranding as the Washington football team was more than a placeholder. It was symbolic of an identity crisis. Who were they now, without the mythology that had long justified their arrogance? Inside the organization, change came painfully. Snyder remained defiant, issuing statements full of denial and self-praise, even as public trust evaporated. Executives resigned or were forced out. Cheerleaders who had been silenced for years finally spoke openly. The stadium that once roared now echoed with apathy. Then came the congressional investigation. In 2022, the U.S. House Committee on Oversight and Reform launched hearings into Washington's workplace misconduct, something no modern NFL team had ever faced. The image of lawmakers grilling league executives under oath marked a turning point. The NFL was no longer policing itself. The dirty laundry of one of its cornerstone franchises was now a matter of public record. It wasn't just about harassment anymore. It was about systemic power. The findings revealed efforts to obstruct investigations, hush money settlements, and even leaked emails that implicated other high-profile figures in the league. It was a web of deceit woven over decades. And at its center was a man who believed himself untouchable. But every empire falls, eventually. By 2023, Snyder was cornered. The NFL's patience ran out. His ownership had become a liability to the league's image and its sponsors. Under mounting pressure, he agreed to sell the team for a record $6.05 billion to a group led by Josh Harris, which included NBA legend Magic Johnson. For fans who had suffered for years, it was Liberation Day. The sale wasn't just a transaction, it was an exorcism. Decades of dysfunction, arrogance, and cruelty were finally expelled. The rebranding to the Washington Commanders was more than cosmetic. It was a chance at resurrection to rebuild trust, restore community, and redefine leadership. But even with new ownership, the path forward wasn't easy. The scars were deep. The franchise had to prove that change wasn't a PR campaign, but a structural overhaul. Employees needed to feel safe. Fans needed to feel proud again. The Commanders' first steps toward transparency, publishing conduct policies, installing new compliance officers, and investing in diversity initiatives were small but vital. On the field, the team reflected that transition. No longer chasing flashy headlines or quick fixes. They focused on stability, hiring respected football minds, drafting with intention, building from the ground up. The 2020s Commanders were a work in progress, but for the first time in decades, progress was genuine. The deeper truth is this: the Washington scandal wasn't an aberration. It was a mirror. It reflected what happens when power goes unchecked, when culture becomes untouchable, when a franchise forgets that football is a public trust, not a personal fiefdom. The Commanders' story is corporate America's cautionary tale about ego, ethics, and the high cost of silence. And yet, beneath the rubble, something resilient survived. The fans, the city. The legacy of men who once wore the uniform with pride. Art Monk, Darrell Green, John Riggins, who stood for something greater than ownership. The Commanders may never fully escape their past, but they can transform it into purpose. Today, when the team takes the field, they carry the weight of all that came before, the triumphs and the transgressions. But they also carry something new: accountability. And in the modern NFL, that's the rarest victory of all. The Washington Commanders didn't just survive scandal, they outlasted it. What remains now is not redemption, but responsibility. Because in football, as in life, rebuilding trust is the hardest game of all. Cleveland has always been a football city, not a brand, not a marketing machine, but a heartbeat that echoed from the industrial belt to the edge of Lake Erie. It's a place where football wasn't entertainment, it was identity. And few fan bases have suffered more, endured more mockery, or displayed more unshakable loyalty than the Cleveland Browns faithful. Their story is one of betrayal and resurrection, a parable of what happens when the soul of a franchise is torn away and the people refuse to let it die. The Browns were once kings. In the 1950s and early 60s, I think they were a dynasty before the word became fashionable. Led by Paul Brown, a coach so visionary that his name defined the team itself. The Browns revolutionized the game with precision, discipline, and innovation. Otto Graham, Jim Brown, and later, Bernie Kosar. They were symbols of pride for a blue-collar city that fought for everything it ever earned. But by the 1990s, that pride was cracking. Decades of frustration built up as ownership faltered. Coaches cycled in and out, and success became a relic of black and white photographs. The team that once defined professional excellence had turned into a cautionary tale. Yet no one, not even the most cynical, could have imagined what would happen in 1995, that year. Owner Art Modell announced that he was moving the Cleveland Browns to Baltimore. Overnight, one of the NFL's founding cities was stripped of its team, its name, its colors, its heritage. The press conference was cold, businesslike. Modell spoke of financial necessity, but to the people of Cleveland, it felt like treason. Grown men wept in bars. Fans stormed the stadium with protest signs, Muckfadl. They chanted a crude but heartfelt anthem of rage. Modell's betrayal wasn't just about football, it was about what Cleveland represented: hard work, loyalty, community. In a city still recovering from economic decline, the Browns were one of the last things people could believe in. When that was taken away, it felt like the city itself was being erased. The final home game in December 1995 became a funeral. Fans ripped out bleacher seats, tore up turf, and chanted as if trying to hold on to something already gone. Baltimore got the franchise, rebranded as the Ravens. The city that once lived for the Browns now watched their former team win Super Bowls under a new name. It was salt in the wound. But something strange happened in Cleveland, something the NFL had never seen before. The fans refused to let go. They didn't move on, didn't pick a new team. They built grassroots movements, protested at league offices, and organized boycotts. They demanded justice, and they got it. In 1998, after relentless pressure, the NFL made an unprecedented promise. The Browns' history, records, and colors would remain in Cleveland. A new Browns team would be born in 1999. Same name, same soul, fresh start. It was, in theory, the perfect redemption, but reality hit hard. The new Browns were a shell of their former selves. Expansion drafts, poor management, and a string of disastrous decisions made the team a league-wide punchline. Coaches came and went. Quarterbacks cycled through like shifts at a steel mill. Hope became the cruelest word in the Cleveland dictionary. From 1999 to 2019, the Browns cycled through 30 quarterbacks, 11 head coaches, and endless heartbreaks. The 2017 season became a symbol of ultimate futility. 0-16, the team didn't win a single game. Fans, in true Cleveland fashion, held a mock funeral parade to commemorate the death of their sanity. It wasn't spiteful, it was satire laced with loyalty. They showed up in freezing temperatures, dressed as mourners, holding signs that read, "Perfect season, 016 forever." It was absurd and beautiful. A city laughing through its pain, united by something deeper than success. Behind that laughter, though, lay something fierce. Cleveland fans weren't waiting for permission to believe again. They were demanding it. And slowly, painfully, the organization began to listen. New general manager John Dorsey arrived in 2017, promising change. Baker Mayfield came next, Brash, emotional, defiant. He wasn't perfect, but he embodied Cleveland's fighting spirit. Then came 2020, the year everything changed. Under head coach Kevin Stefanski, the Browns not only found structure, but belief. They finished 11-5 and made the playoffs for the first time in 18 years. When they beat the Pittsburgh Steelers, their longtime tormentors in the wildcard round, the city erupted. Fireworks, tears, disbelief. It wasn't just a win. It was vindication. For a city scarred by betrayal, it felt like rebirth. The Browns' playoff victory wasn't about erasing the past, it was about reclaiming it. The fans had never abandoned the team, even when the team had abandoned them. That kind of loyalty doesn't fade, it hardens. But even redemption stories have shadows. In 2022, the Browns made a move that shook the league, trading for quarterback Deshaun Watson, who faced more than 20 accusations of sexual misconduct. The decision divided the fan base. Many felt it betrayed the moral foundation that Cleveland had fought so hard to rebuild. The organization defended it as a football decision, but the public backlash was severe. Suddenly, the same franchise that once stood for loyalty and integrity found itself in another moral storm. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. After years of demanding accountability from the league, Cleveland was now the one being questioned. And yet, the city remained unbreakable. That's Cleveland's paradox: outrage and loyalty intertwined. The fans could condemn ownership, question ethics, and still fill the stands on Sunday. Because to them, the Browns are not the front office. They're not the logo or the owner's decisions. The Browns are the fans, the ones who stayed. In many ways, Cleveland's true redemption wasn't measured in wins or losses. It was measured in resilience, in showing that community can outlast corruption, that faith can survive disappointment. Their relationship with the franchise is like family, sometimes ugly, sometimes beautiful, but never abandoned. When you walk through Cleveland on game day, you can feel it. Dog pound flags hanging from porches. Old men wearing cracked Jim Brown jerseys. Children holding signs that say, "We believe." The city's scars are visible, but they've become part of its strength. The Browns' survival is proof that identity, once forged in loyalty, can't be stolen. Not by owners, not by scandals, not by time. And maybe that's the real victory. Not the comeback wins or playoff runs, but the unspoken truth that football, at its best, belongs to the people. That no matter how far a franchise falls, the spirit that sustains it doesn't come from billionaires. It comes from believers. The Cleveland Browns story isn't a fairy tale. It's a testament to pain endured, pride reclaimed, and a city's refusal to forget what was stolen from it. The comeback isn't complete, and maybe it never will be. But Cleveland's redemption doesn't need perfection. It just needs permanence. In the end, the Browns taught the NFL something it often forgets: that no scandal, no betrayal can outlast a city's love for its team. The front office may have the power, but the fans, they have the soul. For decades, the Miami Dolphins were a symbol of composure and class, a franchise born from Don Shula's perfection and discipline, where excellence seemed inevitable and scandal seemed impossible. They were the team that chased perfection and caught it, immortalized in 1972 when they went undefeated. But perfection, as history often reminds us, casts a long shadow. Beneath the sunshine and teal, the modern Dolphins would become a case study in something darker. A story not of physical brutality, but of emotional collapse. It was a reckoning that forced the entire NFL to confront the silent injuries of the mind. The story began, as these stories often do, with pride and pressure colliding in a locker room. In 2013, the Miami Dolphins were in the middle of a rebuild. Head coach Joe Philbin, an even-tempered leader molded in the image of old-school discipline, believed in structure above all else. The team was young, unproven, hungry. But beneath the surface of competition, something was festering. The Dolphins' offensive line was led by two men who could not have been more different. Richie Incognito brash, volatile, a self-proclaimed enforcer who thrived on intimidation. Jonathan Martin, quiet, introspective, a Stanford graduate raised in an environment that prized intellect over aggression. In most organizations, differences like these coexist. In Miami, they collided with devastating results. When Martin walked away from the team mid-season, citing emotional distress, few understood the magnitude of what was happening. Reports surfaced that he'd been the target of relentless harassment, not the playful teasing that NFL locker rooms had long normalized, but sustained psychological torment. Voicemails leaked to the press, Incognito's voice, crude, violent, laced with racial slurs and threats. It was shocking, even by the standards of football's hard-edged culture. The fallout was immediate and explosive. The story dominated headlines, shaking the NFL's self-image to its core. For a league built on toughness, where players were expected to take it and move on, Martin's departure challenged the entire code. Could mental and emotional suffering be as real and as damaging as a torn ACL or a concussion? The Dolphins were suddenly caught in the storm's eye. Players defended the culture. Others condemned it. Some said Martin should have fought back. Others said the locker room had failed him. Coach Philbin, blindsided and seemingly detached, appeared powerless to contain the damage. The team's 2013 season unraveled, and the Dolphins' once-proud reputation took a hit it couldn't ignore. When the NFL commissioned investigator Ted Wells to examine the incident, the report that followed was damning. It described a pattern of persistent harassment, not only from Incognito, but from other teammates, a culture where racial jokes, sexual taunts, and humiliation were woven into daily life. It wasn't just about one bully and one victim. It was about a system that had quietly sanctioned cruelty in the name of toughness. The Wells report forced the Dolphins and the league to confront an uncomfortable truth: that mental health in professional football had been treated like weakness for generations. Players who showed vulnerability risked ridicule, benching, or exile. The expectation was silent endurance. But Martin's story broke that silence wide open. Richie Incognito was suspended and later released. Jonathan Martin, unable to find stability in the wake of public scrutiny, bounced between teams before leaving football altogether. Philbin kept his job for a time, but the culture he'd failed to control eventually consumed him too. Yet, amid the wreckage, something unexpected began to grow awareness. The Dolphins, once the face of the NFL's bullying scandal, began the long process of rebuilding their culture from the inside out. Team owner Stephen Ross launched the Ross Initiative in sports for Equality Rise, aimed at promoting respect and inclusion across all levels of sport. The team began implementing new psychological support systems, hiring mental health professionals, and creating confidential pathways for players to seek help. It wasn't immediate redemption, not in a story like this. The Dolphins' image had been tarnished, and trust takes years to rebuild. But step by step, the organization began redefining what strength meant. The same franchise that once glorified silent suffering was now advocating for empathy, for education, for dialogue. The transformation wasn't only about damage control. It became part of a larger movement across the NFL. Players began speaking openly about depression, anxiety, and post-career identity loss. Brandon Marshall, a former Dolphin himself, went public about his diagnosis with borderline personality disorder. He became one of the league's leading advocates for mental health awareness. Others followed. Calvin Ridley, Dak Prescott, and Lane Johnson all shared their struggles, breaking through a wall that had once been impenetrable. In Miami, this reckoning took on a deeper meaning. The Dolphins' locker room, once the epicenter of cruelty, became a testing ground for compassion. Coaches began incorporating mental health education into rookie orientation programs. Veteran players mentored younger ones not just on how to handle the blitz, but how to handle the weight of expectation. Still, the journey wasn't linear. The Dolphins faced new challenges in the years that followed. Controversies involving coaching turnover, leadership dysfunction, and the 2022 allegations of tampering and tanking. But the lessons of 2013 lingered like a scar. When Tua Tagovailoa suffered a terrifying concussion in 2022, collapsing on live television, the entire organization responded differently. The Dolphins' medical staff was scrutinized, protocols were questioned, and the public demanded accountability. But this time, the conversation wasn't just about physical health. It was about care, humanity, and responsibility. That night, as Tua lay motionless, millions of fans across the world felt a collective silence. It was a reminder that the game, for all its beauty and violence, is played by human beings. And perhaps that's what Miami's long road had been leading toward, understanding that the true strength of a franchise isn't measured in toughness, but in how it protects its people. The Dolphins' transformation didn't erase their past. It reframed it. Their scandal became a case study for sports psychologists, leadership experts, and even military programs on the dangers of unchecked culture. Miami had gone from cautionary tale to catalyst, from the subject of national shame to an unlikely pioneer in changing how professional sports view the mind. Today, when you walk into the Dolphins facility, you'll still find echoes of the old ethos: competition, pride, pressure. But you'll also find something that didn't exist before 2013. An acknowledgement that pain and always show on the surface. That strength can coexist with vulnerability. That winning the right way means more than what the scoreboard says. The Dolphins' reckoning was never about one player or one scandal. It was about the entire foundation of what football teaches men to be, and what happens when that lesson becomes a cage. Miami broke that cage. Not perfectly, not easily, but permanently. The Dolphins may never escape the memory of 2013. And maybe they shouldn't, because that darkness forced the league to see the unseen, to care for what it once ignored. In that sense, Miami became something far greater than a team. It became a turning point, and in the quiet moments, long after the games end and the cameras fade, that's what endures. The reminder that redemption isn't always about victory. Sometimes it's about humanity rediscovered in the unlikeliest of places under the harshest of lights. The story of football has always been a story of contradiction, of beauty born from brutality, of unity forged through division, of glory stained by scandal. It's a game where triumph and tragedy coexist in the same frame, where the cheers of millions drown out the silent suffering of the few who made it all possible. The NFL is more than a league. It's America's great theater, part morality play, part Greek tragedy, part mirror to the nation that built it. To understand football's soul, you have to accept its paradox, that its greatest power lies not in perfection, but in its capacity to endure imperfection. Every scandal that rocked the league, every concussion cover-up, every locker room betrayal, every owner's corruption or player's fall from grace has not destroyed the game. It has instead revealed why the game survives. The NFL is not innocent. It never was. But it is resilient, endlessly reborn through cycles of outrage, redemption, and the collective need to believe in something larger than the scandal itself. This is the mythology of football. Not that it is flawless, but that it keeps rising from the wreckage of its own contradictions. From the early chaos of the league's formation to the modern billion-dollar juggernaut it became, football has always balanced on the knife's edge between progress and self-destruction. The same intensity that drives players to greatness also drives them toward danger. The same ambition that built dynasties also invited deceit. When the Saints put bounties on opponents, when the Patriots filmed sidelines, when the Commanders hid behind toxic corporate walls, these weren't just moments of moral collapse. They were glimpses into the same hunger that built the sports mythos: to dominate, to endure, to win no matter the cost. And yet, for all its flaws, football keeps finding redemption. The Ravens rebuilt after Ray Lewis's trial. The Eagles found unity after years of internal chaos. The Browns rose from ridicule to relevance. The Saints, once the face of scandal, became the embodiment of resilience after Katrina, reminding the nation that faith can still exist in the wreckage. The pattern is universal: downfall, reflection, rebirth. It's the same pattern that defines not only the sport, but the American psyche itself. Football is our mythology because it mirrors who we are, capable of breathtaking courage and catastrophic failure in the same breath. At its core, the NFL is built on forgiveness. Players fall, teams fail, franchises implode, and yet, every season, the slate resets. Every September, the crowd returns, hoping, believing, forgetting. The field becomes a sanctuary for second chances. And maybe that's why we love it so deeply. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. But forgiveness without truth is fragile. For decades, the league's biggest sin was not the violence itself. It was the refusal to confront it. Men lost their memories, their families, their lives, and the machine kept moving. That denial is what gave rise to the darkest chapters of the sport's history. When the NFL finally acknowledged the concussion crisis, when it faced racial inequity, when it admitted the cost of its own image, those were moments not of weakness, but of reckoning. The beauty of football lies not in its ability to hide its flaws, but in its struggle to reconcile them. Each scandal forced evolution. Each revelation peeled back another layer of the myth. The game became more than sport. It became a study in accountability and how far a culture can bend before it breaks. And yet, even now, the paradox endures. The league thrives because of its scandals as much as despite them. Every controversy fuels narrative. Every redemption arc renews faith. The NFL has mastered the alchemy of turning disgrace into drama and drama into devotion. It is both villain and savior, both subject and storyteller. The dark truth is that the machine needs both sin and salvation to survive. There's something almost biblical about it. The fallen hero seeking redemption. The crowd that condemns, then cheers again. The promise that next season, everything will be different. It's an endless resurrection, a gospel of helmets and headlines. And maybe that's why the sport feels immortal, because it speaks to something older than competition. It speaks to the human condition, to our thirst for redemption, even when we, Dan T, deserve it. The NFL's story will never be clean. It will never be simple. It is built on blood and brilliance, corruption and courage, deception and devotion. And that is what gives it weight. What makes it real? We can ignore the ghosts that haunt the field. The players who can remember their children's names. The coaches who burned out chasing impossible perfection. The fans who sacrifice reason for loyalty. These are the unseen casualties of the spectacle. But they're also part of its truth. Because football, for all its pageantry, has always been about sacrifice. Not the sanitized kind sold in commercials, but the raw human kind that leaves scars. Every generation inherits the same contradiction. We celebrate the game for its purity, even as we know it's built on compromise. We chant for heroes, knowing they're human. We condemn the league's hypocrisy, but we still tune in every Sunday. That's the paradox, and maybe the confession. The NFL's legacy, like America's, will always be complicated. It will always be both triumph and tragedy, inspiration and warning. The beauty of football isn't in pretending those truths coexist. It's in the courage to look them both in the eye. What makes the sport sacred is not the scoreboard or the trophy. It's the struggle, the refusal to stay down. Every player who stands up after a hit that should have broken him. Every team that rebuilds after disgrace. Every fan who keeps believing after betrayal. They are all part of the same mythology. The same heartbeat. Because football, at its essence, isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. It's about what we're willing to endure, forgive, and fight for. The dark truth beneath glory is that every empire hides a shadow. The NFL's shadow is long, and it stretches across the minds, bodies, and souls of those who built it. But shadows only exist because something is standing in the light. And perhaps that is football's final redemption, not in pretending to be pure, but in daring to be honest about its darkness. In the end, the league's scandals will fade, its champions will be replaced, and its records will fall. But what will remain is the story, the eternal struggle between chaos and order, greed and grace, victory and virtue. The story of a game that mirrors the nation that made it, flawed, fierce, unbreakable. When the lights go out and the stadium empties, what lingers is not the noise, but the silence, the echo of everything football has meant and everything it has taken. It's the sound of resilience, of redemption, of ghosts refusing to be forgotten. Because in the end, football isn't just about winning, it's about surviving. And maybe that's why, despite everything, we keep coming back, not for perfection, but for proof that even in a world built on scandal, redemption is still possible. That's football's greatest paradox, and its greatest truth.